everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pico. A bit of history into this episode. In March 2003, the United States and the United Kingdom, alongside other allies such as Poland, Spain or Portugal, invaded Iraq with the pretext of decoupling Saddam Hussein because of an allegation that Iraq had developed weapons of mass destruction. The invasion was deemed illegal according to then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, and was seen as a new phase of the global war against terror that the US launched after the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Saddam Hussein was overthrown in less than 2 months. By 2004, he was found. By 2005, he was tried for crimes against humanity and executed by hanging in 2006. Saddam loyalists, Sunni Ba'athis, kept resisting and will be the initial core of the insurgency that will keep on fighting for the years to come. In May 2003, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq signs an order disbanding the Iraqi army and intelligence services. We're talking about more than 300,000 well-armed men into the streets. The weapons of mass destruction were never found, although it was the main mantra repeated to justify the invasion, and by early 2004, the US government started acknowledging that they might have gotten misleading intelligence reports. A presidential commission concludes in March 2005 that not one bit of the pre-war intelligence on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction panned out. Since 2003, more than 1 million airmen, soldiers, sailors, and marines served in the country. The cost of the conflict was really high, $800 billion for the US Department of Treasury, others say more than $1 trillion, with nearly 4,500 Americans and were over 100,000 Iraqis killed during the war. However, this number can increase up to 600,000 or even 1 million because of the side effects of the invasion. In the turmoil that followed the invasion, Al-Qaeda, for example, started a massive bombing campaign, particularly against Shiite places, sparking ethno-religious violence all over the country that reflected in the next of the region until today. The number of Iraqis who died in the conflict is uncertain. Well, this has been a little bit of an introduction to what we want to talk about today. And here I have Milos Dangubic with me. How are you doing?
Oh, good. Thank you for inviting me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Always happy to have you. And obviously, Ronan Wordsworth, how are you doing, mate?
Very good. Feeling fresh.
Feeling fresh?
Ready to produce a very good episode.
You're really busy lately, so we were lucky to catch you. As you may have imagined already, what we're going to talk about is the American invasion to Iraq. This happened in 2003, and ever since, the region itself has been in a violent turmoil. The invasion proved to be successful in a first place. Saddam was decoupled, but the United States troops and allied troops stayed in the country until 2011 and even further, training troops and police. But the situation of the country arguably didn't improve too much. There were many mistakes committed during the invasion. Even from the United States, voices pointing out that there was no real plan onto what to do with Iraq, that they were just improvising on the way. And in the end, withdrawing their troops entirely in 2011 with Barack Obama, except for some training troops, alongside with, again, other international actors. So we are in 2023, and last month it was the 20th anniversary of the invasion, and ever since we've grown up, and the Middle East has changed a lot, and we would like to talk a little bit about it. So I would like to start this conversation by asking you guys a little bit. Basically, the invasion of Iraq is the top 3 first geopolitical big issues that we heard about in our lives. We were still kids, but obviously the ramifications and the impact in our societies was at different levels, but it was important. So I would like to start by asking you, do you remember when it happened? And even if you don't remember when it happened, do you remember what was the feeling of the population in your countries? Because let's not forget, Milos is from Montenegro, Ronan is from Australia, me, myself, I'm from Spain. Different backgrounds, different histories. So let's see. Milos, what was for you?
Yeah, I would say I was 9 years old then, and I remember it kind of, how to say. And for our population's attitude towards the war was, of course, negative because just 4 years before invasion of Iraq, USA and allies also had a bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, which Montenegro was part of back then. So again, people had, I would say, some kind of empathy as well because we felt it on our skin, and also the prevailing narrative was quite basic one. I must admit, everybody says America is again going to war for oil. They are imperialists, and the usual stuff that are being said.
How was Ronan?
Yeah, well, for me, I think it was very much tied to the Afghanistan war in Australian mind, because that was one war 2 years earlier which we sent troops to in support of US goals and ambitions. And then just less than 2 years later, we were once again sending more troops to the Middle East, which for Australian perspective is a very long way away geopolitically. And I think people were not very happy at all about the invasion to start with in Australia. They saw John Howard, our Prime Minister at the time, alongside Tony Blair and US President George Bush, obviously, standing up and telling the people that this was a legitimate war, that we had to go and fight to prevent the propagation and stop Saddam Hussein with his weapons of mass destruction, which you touched upon before, which were obviously never found and came out years later. There was no credible evidence really in the lead up to the war that ever existed. And I think the Australian population were just thinking, we're not America. Why are we following American interests? This is not our war. We have no reason to be there. People didn't like Afghanistan, but it was much more popular than Iraq because there was a tangible threat that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had shown in Afghanistan. And so there was actually a target. Here was Saddam Hussein, the leader of a country, and regime change is never pretty, I think. That's the thing. Like, to go into another country and affect regime change is a huge step to take. And there's massive geopolitical ramifications for doing that. And I mean, I'm not trying to say that every person is fully aware of the implications, but you just think to go into another country, and we're Australia, we shouldn't be involved in the Middle East. I think that was the prevailing thought process behind it.
So the main reason behind going with the United States there was to decouple Saddam Hussein, or was it also the part of the war on terror, which we'll talk about later? Was it put all in the same pack?
Yeah, definitely it was put in the same pack because it's more convenient, I think, to do that, especially to Australian population who probably didn't have a clue who Saddam Hussein was. Like, why are we going into the Middle East to dismount a president that, most Australians couldn't name, quite frankly. Whereas, even though we hadn't had a terrorist attack, I think you can point to 9/11 and say, this is a Western country. We have a lot of cultural similarities with the United States. So say,
you both have Fox News.
We both have
and
Fox
News. And it was a vivid picture of terrorists. It was direct threat.
Exactly.
It's their fault.
It's a face to the threat almost. So it was a different thing, this. And then I guess it's always been coupled with just the general war on terror, even though it was obviously something different.
Well, for me, in Spain, actually, the government at the time was really, really into getting into Iraq. Like, super into getting into Iraq. It was sold to us like we were partners at the same level with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Portugal in invading Iraq, because we were going for the sake of freedom, for the sake of democracy. For us, it was more, I would say, more on the sense of there is this dictator, which is terrible with his population, and potentially there's some ramifications with terrorism and so, but we had our own internal terrorism in that time, at least in the people. It wasn't that deep, Al-Qaeda or similar groups. Obviously 9/11 was a thing, but we had our own internal stuff. But it was sold like we were saviors. And I remember the president going there, and still years later, when Bush already like retracted himself a little bit or whatever, our former president at the time, he kept on saying, yes, of course, and we did what we had to do, and going there. But I remember that the population wasn't in favor of that at all. And in Madrid, there was this massive demonstration. Like, I think it was like 1 million people in the street. It was something crazy. One of the biggest ones, because I remember that when the invasion started, there were several demonstrations all over the world. It happened also in the United States and so on. The one in Madrid was massive. The one in London was also really big, I remember. So the population was never really into invading Iraq. We didn't see the point of that. And actually, in that moment, we started feeling that there was a threat for us because we would put ourselves in the target from... In that moment, it was like maybe some Islamic terrorist group or maybe some other problem. And actually, in 2004, in March 2004, we had a terrorist attack in Madrid.
Yep.
Which was the biggest in like mortality terrorist attack that we've ever had. And it was a shock. And the population was against being in Iraq. However, we stayed there for a little bit longer.
Just on that then, what do you think was the government's motivation for pushing it so hard? Because I think from an Australian perspective, it's kind of obvious what our motivations are. We like to see ourselves very close allies with the United States and UK, so we followed their instruction, whereas Spain, although being Western allies, of course, they're much more integrated with Europe rather than being a close US ally. So what was the government's motivations, do you think?
That's precisely what you're saying now, that Australia sees itself like a par with the UK and the United States in the end, like civilizational wise and everything. Like it's pretty close. That was what the government in that moment wanted to. As the government in Poland, for example. Why did Poland invade alongside the United States? Because they were building their international image after the time in communism and then having the new democracy. And so, in a way, that government wanted to have that international...
build a status.
Exactly. They wanted to build a status internationally. That's why it was sold to us so much that our president was there in a picture with Tony Blair and George Bush in the Azores Island. It was really like... Until I started university, I thought it was it was Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States that invaded Iraq.
You called all decisions.
Dude, exactly. And then you learn about it, and it's like, but you were the last ones in the queue. I mean, you did invade, but you literally were the last ones in the queue. But yes, that was the problem. And actually, that particular government, that particular president, wanted to run again for the elections in 2004. But 1 week before the elections, or 2 weeks before the elections, this terrorist attack happened. And there was a cover-up that meant, because basically, if it had been an Islamic terrorist group who had put the attack, who had made the terrorist attack, that meant that government would be seen as guilty for bringing us to Iraq.
And bringing the threat back home to
Exactly.
Spain.
Whereas if it was, there were already Islamist radical threats to Spain because it's a historical territory, but they didn't properly, it was in the beginning of it.
Exactly. It was not an acute threat.
Yes. However, after 2004 happened, that government fell because obviously it was related. As soon as they found a cassette that they were singing in Arabic, that was done. That government was done.
I do remember that, actually, even from Australia, about the Spanish elections and straight after the terrorist attack, as you said.
Yeah, that was really, really big. Okay, then a little bit in what we saw. Now let's talk a little bit more from our experience with geopolitics and so. And I would like to talk a little bit about the regional geopolitical effects of the war. Just put it into perspective, as I was saying before. Well, Iraq was a country that was actually belligerent in the region. In the 80s, they invaded Iran. A little bit later, they invaded Kuwait. Mm-hmm. They lost in Iran, and from Kuwait, a United States-led Operation Desert Storm managed to liberate Kuwait, and actually went all over Baghdad until Baghdad. But it is true that Iraq, once the invasion took place and once that absolutist government fell, it went in shambles, and there were many groups there operating. and it became the battlefield for many provinces in the Middle East. So what do you think, what would you say was the biggest geopolitical change that, not just the invasion, but the aftermath of the first year of the invasion happened?
Because there's multiple different things. I think, first of all, we have to look at the makeup of the Middle East. First, we have to look at the makeup of the Middle East and the power dynamics there. So since the war, Iran came much more to prominence. And then we ended up in sort of a Middle Eastern bipolar situation where we had Saudi Arabia on one side and Iran on the other. And a lot of the destabilization that's come about since then in the Middle East can almost be traced back to the Iraq war, because they were a little bit of obviously, as you said, they were belligerent towards some of the neighbors, but they kept some of the other countries in check in a way where there was not just a bipolar order, with the Saudis or with Iran. There was Iraq there as well as another very strong, powerful player. And it really meant that there was not as many of these proxy wars, which we've seen since. So we've seen Yemen, we've seen Syria, we've seen
Iraq in itself
being, for the last 10 years, having Saudi-backed and Iranian-backed forces there, and continued destabilization in the countries. And then secondary effect of that, I think, directly is that we've seen a bunch of insurgency groups, because there's all these areas, there's weak governments across the country, especially in Iraq, but in some of these other countries where there's civil wars being fought. And then because of these weak governments, it gives rise to a lot of ungoverned space, a lot of areas where a lot of black spots, a lot of places where insurgency groups can operate. So then these, again, I think can be somewhat traced back to the Iraq war, because, okay, we had Al-Qaeda beforehand. We had the Taliban in charge of the Afghani government for a long time. But the groups that came after them, we see like ISIS, we see the expansion of Al-Qaeda into Yemen, into other countries. We see the Syrian, well, that's ISIS.
The Syrian, and the second part of the Syrian
civil war. Because it was much easier for those non-government groups to rally around the flag, because when you have direct invasion of foreign forces that are not familiar with your culture and anything, it was easier for them to make extreme Islamist group, because then you have foreign invader, which is different religion, and they are coming to your house, killing your civilians. And it was much easier, in addition to that people lived in much war situation during the war. So for them, the only way out was to join some of these Islamist groups. And as we saw, I think Iraqi war led directly to the creation of Islamic State and to broader and broader tensions in the region.
Actually, in that sense, it's interesting, because I remember back in the day, like when 9/11 happened, and so like it was like the lion when it's at its weakest is the most dangerous, or something like that. I think that's how the saying goes. Like because they hit the United States was gonna come in full force, and it was gonna put everything. But with perspective, I feel like the invasion of Afghanistan opened the Pandora box in the Middle East. Because there were tensions before. I mean, it's not saying the Middle East was not peaceful. Again, there were many issues. Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, Iraq. Okay, there's many issues, but these
Middle East has never really
these uncontrollable insurgencies that came out from that. Like, there was no insurgency in the 90s that could take over like 1/3 of Iraq and 1/3 of Syria and hold it
and
for 3 years.
Territory with the most oil resources as well. We shouldn't forget that. Like, I would agree, in the 90s it was unimaginable that some Islamist terrorist group could have a grip on oil production in the region. So,
And do you think, because I've been reading and we've been checking some stuff lately, that's how the invasion of Iraq, actually, like the main enemy from the United States, like since the 80s, there was Saudi Arabia. Iran. And in 2001, the American-led intervention takes the Taliban out of power, which are Sunni and competitors to Iran. And in 2003, 2004, they take Saddam Hussein out of the table. And so Iran can start expanding its proxy warfare and its interventions its indirect interventions in other countries. Do you think that it actually helped them?
Definitely. I mean, I think if we look at Iran since they developed, that's when they started developing their nuclear weapons program. They have more of a justification for that to their local population, saying America is the real enemy. Look what they did to our neighbors, even though they're not friendly neighbors. It doesn't really matter. I think it's a Middle Eastern country.
If we don't pursue see what happened to Saddam. That happened because he didn't have weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly.
That won't happen to us if we have.
Exactly,
and it's kind of true. I would admit, because if you look at the American foreign policy after Iraq, like I said, it just opened Pandora box. After that, we had Libya, and then we had Syria. So it was just the beginning of this war. Had also much bigger geopolitical, not only regional impact, because after all this, I think this led the American interventions in the Middle East. It led also Russia and China to be more involved in the region, because if USA can invade and protect their interests, what is stopping then Russia to protect Bashar al-Assad, or China to make deals with Iran and things like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just one more thing on that. I think it's important to separate Afghanistan war and the Iraqi war, even though it's very easy to group them together, because it's obviously both American and Allied forces fighting in the Middle East against different groups, and there was regime change in both instances, but one was against a defined target that was a legitimate threat, which was obviously Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and one was against the leader of a country, which was Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So I think the goals were different, and then because of that, I think we look at the outcomes from the wars, and they were quite different, where once regime change was achieved in Iraq, they didn't really know what to do from there.
However, I totally agree with you that they are different. And even Afghanistan, I would say that is at least more justifiable than Iraq, because Iraq is based in a lie. Iraq is based in the lie that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction where there were no weapons of mass destruction.
And that there was evidence and there was no evidence.
And then there was evidence, and within a year there's no evidence.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I actually having a conversation regarding this topic not that long ago. I think that after time, if you see George Bush, I genuinely think that guy thought that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Because literally the guy looks like, I fucked up. Like, he's got this face of like, I fucked up. And he's got this face of I fucked up until he loses the elections in 2008, since 2006, 2007. When it's clear that there is no justification to continue the war, they don't know what they are doing. Again, they keep on changing alliances with locals. The situation doesn't get better. The government
actually gets worse.
It gets worse, and then they leave with Obama, and it gets
nothing.
It gets to nothing. It gets like now Iraq is a country like where Baghdad is reconstructed. It goes more or less fine. The levels of terrorism in certain areas, controlled areas of Iraq, have lowered clearly, but in northern Iraq, you have the Islamic State until 2017, 2018 active, and you need the Kurds to help you out getting rid of ISIS. And there's still those tribal problems. There's still those ethnic or ethno-religious problems. I mean, one reality of all these dictators, and you can point at Saddam, or you can point at Gaddafi, or you can point at any of these, is like, for as terrible as they were,
there were some reasons why they ruled like
there were some reasons why they got into power in the first place, and it's because they managed to maintain some sort of balance between
some stability
within the country, which is true. Then,
I mean, Libya was a much more successful country before intervention under Gaddafi.
Gaddafi,
kind of a brutal dictator.
A brutal dictator, yes.
But the quality of life under a brutal dictator was probably better than what's come since. That's the sad reality of the case.
At least there was a state back in
exactly.
the day. Like now, arguably, Libya doesn't have a state.
And yeah, like I said, also with now the situation in Iraq, the intervention enabled Iran to have even bigger influence now in Iraq. We could say that now Iran has more influence than USA in Iraq.
Yes.
By this invasion, USA is strengthened their biggest enemy in the region.
Yes, and in the end, the governments in Iraq were Shiite, were Shia. So it was like, honestly, like it was a
mess.
It was a mess. It's a mess.
In summary,
Yes.
that's
That could be the
a
summary.
4-word summary. It was a mess.
Okay, I want to go a little bit into this part of like invading a country. Okay, now Russia last year invaded Ukraine, as we all know, and it's an illegal action under international law. It's totally despicable, in my opinion. It's the invasion of sovereignty of a neighboring state against their will and killing civilians and so on.
What did George Bush say about it?
Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway, 75.
Well, okay, now we have George Bush. Okay. We've seen this video before. I mean, this lapsus where he says there's like no one person could decide to invade a country like Iraq. Sorry, Ukraine. And then just afterwards, he says, well, Iraq too. And you can take that, well, Iraq too, two options. One of them is like, well, obviously you cannot invade Iraq now because it's a sovereign state. Or
I mean, he was the
he
leader
himself
at the time.
literally saying, I did, and it's,
I made a mistake.
and I made a mistake, and it's fucked up. Like, you are not gonna accept that you did a mistake, and that's one of the things that I want to come here. Invasions by other states to like the post World War II order of 1945, based in sovereignty of states and the secrecy of territorial integrity. This we can see after 1945 that, well, it's great in the UN Charter, but there's been interventions, especially from bigger countries, from great powers. And in this sense, there's one question that I would like to pose, and then we can talk about like potential similarities or whatever. But now that the West is back in Ukraine, in what I think is a legitimate backing of a democratic government against an invasion, but clearly the West doesn't have that support from many places in the world, because what they feel is like, well, but you did this and you did that.
Many more times.
A double standard, basically.
It's a double standard. Like, don't you think...
It's claimed double standard, we'll say.
It's a claimed double standard, but with Iraq, for example, we can call it a double standard.
Well, I would just like to say, yeah, my opinion of that is it's not a double standard in the same sense. I think Iraq was wrong, but again, like we separate Iraq and Afghanistan, we have to separate Iraq from the war in Ukraine. I think the war in Iraq was not America trying to take the territory and make it an American state, whereas in Ukraine, that's exactly what Russia is trying to do. So I think fundamentally there's some differences. I think that there's no good justification for the Iraq war, but there's still some underlying differences to the current situation in Ukraine. I think and the problem is, like, by these actions, the West does definitely lose legitimacy in third-party countries' eyes, because it's very easy to point to these occasions and say, look, you intervened here, you did this. And the only option is to say, yes, we did do that. It was wrong.
That's where my question goes. Like, do you think in order for, like, from now on to have a legitimacy because we see the system post for 1945 eroding in certain ways, we're probably coming to a multipolar world where there's different actors with regional power that before they were not that conceivable, because the United States or before the Soviet Union, like, they were overpowering everyone. Do you think that the West should actually acknowledge certain messes that they did in the past so that they could get legitimacy in their actions?
I don't think, because I think if they, I agree it was wrong, of course, what they did, but I think if they accept their mistake, then they will maybe even lose even more legitimacy, however this crazy sounds, but like, if somebody from third world country says, oh, you see, they admit that they attack us without reason, without legitimacy, why would listen to them that they are being serious about defending Ukraine and some other people? You see, they are looking only of their own interests. So maybe I think it's for the West better to keep their position of like moral superiority or something like that, because they still have soft power means to make other countries, at least some countries in the Western world, believe them that they're still the most important global actor that has some right to do it. But like I said, I think it's for me it's hypocritical to support this much, not to accuse other countries of doing the same thing that you did many more times. So there is no easy answer for the Western countries to this question.
I understand what you say, and there we enter in the great power politics, and we enter in this. We enter in something that is more than the hard power, which is what you were mentioning, the soft power, and it's also how you frame what you do.
Yeah.
And when the United States led this invasion, they framed it as weapons of mass destruction, whatever. Like
preemptive strike.
They weren't condemned by the UNGA, for example, or by the UNSC, for example.
Unlike Ukraine.
They didn't want it, like France, Germany, and Russia said, no, this is not right, and China, no, this is not right, but no one went and said, like, we're going to impose sanctions.
The US has the most soft power in the world, by far. So they can get that veneer of legitimacy maybe from having this soft power. And as you said, it's also about how you frame it, for sure, because by saying that you've got weapons of mass destruction, again, it lends some credibility to a threat and a regional threat. But yeah, the goals are the thing that also dictates, and I think once again, well, it's hard to determine exactly what the US goals were besides regime change.
Like
where they say oil, they say
have basic one, but it's not the only one.
Exactly,
it's easy. Oil and internal validity.
And then
like, we've been attacked. We need to react.
Exactly. So they're just firing off into the Middle East.
Yeah, like we said, you need a face to put on the thread. So Saddam was probably the best pick at the point.
Because they weren't getting Osama bin Laden anytime soon because they couldn't find him.
A lot of caves in Afghanistan.
Exactly. So then, as you say, then it's another internal projection to try and win support for the government.
But I would say also, which is important, that Iraqi war, I think, was the first crack or first blemish on American soft power since they are the unipolar power.
Yeah.
Because before that they had also interventions in the 90s. There was some resistance to them, but not as nearly as Iraq, at least in the late phase of Iraq war. So because of that, I think the next American operations in the region, such as Libya and Syria, I think had even more backlash initially than Iraqi war.
And I guess were more constrained by that
by their public as well.
By their internal support for more intervention in the Middle East. The appetite just wasn't there to go back to the Middle East, to Syria or Libya. So we saw much smaller American forces deployed in those countries for a much shorter time.
In Libya, there was no feet on the ground.
Exactly.
No, and actually,
and even Syria
they were supporting, but in Libya, who ended up bombing Gaddafi was France with Italy.
Yeah.
So it's
so it definitely shifted American foreign policy in the Middle East without a doubt, I would say.
To this point that where we are now, that we don't know if they are still be here or they are leaving.
That's interesting. Now, okay, then let's fast forward into today, more or less, or like the last 2 years. Ever since the invasion, then we had the Syrian civil war. We had the fight against ISIS. Massive numbers of terrorist attacks and deaths and wounded there. But now we're in 2023, and suddenly we can always count on since the Arab Spring of 2011, we can count on 4 regional powers: Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, because Egypt it's a historical regional power, but it lost its track.
And they're kind of in the middle of all.
And right now, Egypt is kind of
Egypt is being colonized by this. Colonized, it's being moved around by these other regional powers.
And right now, they've got no real ability to project power. They've got their own too much internal struggles to deal with, I think, to be considered.
Precisely. So what the thing is that is, so we had this Cold War that we mentioned between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Turkey came as a regional power after 2005, 2007, blah, blah, blah. And it started being more present in the region. It shifted eastwards. And there was this, like they were again supporting other groups. We leave Israel out of the table because Israel is its own world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 2023, we have a rapprochement between Turkey and Egypt, which had close embassies in 10 years ago. A rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Which is the biggest surprise.
Which is the biggest surprise.
Nobody saw that coming.
And it's going faster than, because
exactly
the speed of
they already opened embassies. And
it's so fast. Like 1 month ago, when they firstly met in Beijing, the analysis were like, okay, yes, really nice words, but then how do you put this into practice? I don't know how will they put it into practice, because they're supporting different groups.
No, but we've seen
in 3 different countries they have proxy wars.
Exactly, but we've seen right now in Yemen, just over the weekend, we had an Omani-led dialogue discussions between Saudi Arabian officials and the Houthi rebels, which hold a seat in Yemen's capital, Sana'a, by kicking out the Saudi-backed government. And the Houthi rebels were backed by Iran. And there's no way that this discussions would have been held even a month ago until this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So already we're seeing like some sort of potential end to the Yemeni civil war, which was the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world for the last decade. We have 8 years of continuous war.
Brutal war.
Saudi bombing, Houthis killing, attacking across the border into Saudi, and getting their weapons from Iran. So this already is having we're seeing tangible shifts in the Middle East right now as a result of the Saudi-Iranian.
And let's go into that, because we were talking about the American image, how it got deteriorated because of Iraq. Also, they've left Afghanistan 1 year and a half ago.
Even in Syria, they have less troops. And the situation when the Americans started leaving was still the same. There was still this competition. But then you have 2 particular situations that, in my opinion, have changed it. One is COVID, because those countries are closed, especially because of trade. Trade is shut down. Saudi Arabia also cannot get that much money. Iran gets in a lot of financial trouble. And then the Russian invasion to Ukraine, where suddenly Iran cannot rely on Russia, for example, to keep on providing weapons. And it's Iran who's providing weapons to Russia. At the same time, you have the Saudis that they keep on fighting everywhere, but they've been detaching from the United States, and they're going, I don't like to say closer to China, because I don't see the Saudis being closer, allies to China as it was back in the day with the United States.
I don't think so. I think they're doing their own thing.
But they're doing their own thing. Like you said, COVID and all, because since 2003, there's just wars and turmoil in the region, and Saudis, which have obviously money, I think they need stability to build their project. As you know, they have megalomaniac construction projects all around. And because I think in Jeddah, literally all over the country. And I think
they have 2. They have one that is a massive...
they have that line.
The line, the line.
170 kilometers or something.
I think it's called the wall.
It's called the line.
The line.
170 kilometer city.
In desert.
In a desert.
And for that, like I said, they need stability. And with turmoil in domestic US policy, they don't know if they can rely. First, Biden was harsh on Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of Khashoggi, but then he visited as well Saudi Arabia. And I think Saudi Arabia is trying now more to go to the economic prosperity. And for that, I think their natural partner in that would obviously be China, which is mostly looking at their foreign policy, at least in the countries that are not in China's immediate surroundings to just project economic power, not like hard military power. And it's logical as for China, which tries to have good relations both with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I see the reason why they want to make peace between them, because, like you said, it's bad for business if you have
bad for business,
bad
exactly.
for business. And maybe I don't, like I said, I'm a bit skeptical if, of course, obviously it will not be peace, but it's good signs, these reapproachments, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, we could finish 2023 with a calm Middle East, relatively calm.
I believe it when I see it.
Except let's see what happens with Israel. That's maybe for another episode. But the trend is to cooperation more than earlier this year. Iran accused Saudi Arabia of using drones to blow defense facilities, like drone making facilities in Iran, in Tehran. And now we have them in Beijing. The Iranian government has announced that the Saudi government has invited the president to come to Saudi Arabia and that they will go. It's a massive change. Like it's literally, or at least the beginning of a game changer. And I see the disappearance of the United States from the table. They're supporting hardcorely supporting Saudi Arabia, being also like how Saudi Arabia is seeing itself in the world, how Iran is seeing itself in the world. Like they can more or less control still politically through soft power the Middle East, because they have the capacity, although Iran is in an economic crisis and like with internal turmoil, but still having a less demanding foreign policy could allow the regime to focus on
fixing the domestic issues. But
fixing the domestic issues.
If you want to put it like that.
If you want to put it like that.
But I think it's interesting, 20 years on now from the Iraq War, that the US now is almost their strongest ally in the region, Israel, is now the main focus of almost a united Middle East as being the main perpetrator and main violent actor that they want to act against. So we've almost come full circle now, where the Middle East is again the US again.
Like these wars, I would say, benefited mostly Israel. Like divide and conquer for them was the name of the game. But now with this reapproachment, I think they are kind of the biggest loser in the region, because, like I said, now if Iran has good relation with Saudi Arabia, they could focus all their power, to their biggest enemy, Israel. So.
And if they settle some sort of permanent ceasefire in Yemen, and there's also talks that Saudi Arabia may reopen its embassy in Damascus, and they've been fueling the insurgency against Bashar al-Assad since the beginning. Two major conflicts in the Middle East may be set for ceasefire. Like it would be a big shift. And I think the biggest winner of this all is, I mean, those two regional entities, like they're clearly winning in that sense. Or at least it's my opinion. When you have, as you were mentioning, Milos, when you have a more peaceful neighbor, business is better. And then there enters China, which settles its position as an international mediator in one of the most complex conflicts of the century. Every single accord has been signed in Beijing. China is brokering these accords.
And it was kind of done in secrecy. Like we said, nobody saw this coming this quickly. And to be at least started to be implemented this quickly, I think it's also like a big diplomatic win for China. And it's also gave opportunities for other Middle Eastern countries to do similar. Because before this, you had only one sheriff in town, to say like that. You had only USA and you can only go through them. Then since war in Syria, we see that Russia is willing to defend some of the rulers there if it's in their interest. And we see China that is ready to broker deals that, of course, is beneficial for them because they are investing in Middle East like they're investing
they need
anywhere.
to put the BRI through somewhere.
And then again, for those Middle Eastern countries, I think maybe they are finally getting tired of war. Although, like I said, I don't think it will be peace, but at least for now, I think it could be a bit more peaceful.
Yeah. But as you said, like, I think the US definitely was the only sheriff to turn to before, and their reputation in the Middle East was ruined by the Iraq War. That's one of the lasting legacies
Yes.
of that war. Is
For
that
sure.
nobody really trusted them to be the peace broker, even though they were doing it maybe for good aims to try and prevent
and even the
stop
retreat.
war.
Even the retreat was like not in the best conditions.
Messy.
Like yes, it was messy too. So
It was messy, and now we see that the Taliban has regained power and basically have done everything that they said that they wouldn't do.
we go to square one without Saddam.
And we're back to square one without Saddam.
But everybody again forgot about Taliban because of war in Ukraine. So
what
they seized the opportunity.
Now do we go to George Bush III and go back? The
Again.
US goes back to
There's
To continue the tradition.
Wait, there's a George Bush.
No, there is brother. There is George the third one, but he will never be third.
that would be yeah.
There will no be trilogy in Iraq.
I want to finish then with one question, and this ideology that was basically developed in the United States of neocons that were basically pushing for these interventions where the United States and the West had to go to other countries and to export democracy or capitalism, because basically, I mean, the first people that entered there were the companies later.
Of course.
Do you think, because of what we're talking, the United States image damaged everything? Do you think these interventions are set to an end? Because right now, what we're seeing is a United States that is more engaged into defending certain territories that are of their interest. So we can have Taiwan, or we can have Ukraine, for example. But we don't have.
They don't export.
We are
democracy.
not in the moment where they say we need to export democracy to this country or this other country, or we need to intervene in this other country. Maybe because, again, they are not the unipolar power anymore. They are not the police of the world anymore. They can't financially, because it's a massive burden for the American.
I mean, they could, but
it's still.
So, in my opinion, I don't think it's a death of that at all. I think it's a death maybe of interventionism militarily, in the same way that we saw in Iraq 20 years ago. I don't think that they would be willing to stomach doing such a thing again. But we definitely see them trying to export democracy, in my opinion, by the way that they engage economically with countries.
Yes.
They engage economically with the proviso that certain democratic standards are met. We see the way that the IMF and the World Bank operate is often they give bailout under the conditions that certain democratic standards are met. And so I think, no, it's not the end of the neoconservative interventionist situation, but it's definitely changed from one that was militarily focused in Iraq to one that's much more economically focused now, and other soft power and political tools as well. It's not just economically, but also they're much more interested in dialogue, in bringing actors together. I think because Iraq War was so unpopular domestically, they can't afford to do that again. Financially, I think they can easily. They're still the strongest military in the world by a fair way. They still could intervene in countries if they wanted to. They can project power like no other country.
But they're also
China. Well, China's the only other country that's close in power, military strength, and they cannot project.
They don't have historical precedent for that at all.
And they've got no way to get out of the South China Sea, which we might talk about on a later episode. So they're very different. I think the US still has that ability, but they will not use it in the foreseeable future.
I would add also, but this China entering the Middle East, I think, is also threatening the American economic power, because we saw last week, was it that the oil in Beijing, France bought oil in yuans from Saudi Arabia and Beijing market.
And also Saudi cut to half the production of oil
because of OPEC and Russia. So you see, this Middle East is still important.
Yes, of course.
And not only militarily, but as you see, it could make a dent in global use of dollar. I'm not saying the dollar will fall anytime soon, but still, this is for me, it was unimaginable just last year to say that Saudi Arabia will sell oil in other currencies than dollar.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely.
Nobody could see that. So
that's true.
As you say, it's still
early,
the predominant currency for a long time to come.
Yeah, but still, it's like I said,
it's a start
big shift in my opinion.
To alternative options for countries, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been our impression and comments on 20 years onto the invasion of Iraq.
the geopolitical ramifications,
the
lasting
geopolitical
impacts.
ramification, lasting impact. If you have any comments, we would happily hear them and we will happily have a chat with you. And this has been a new episode of the Geopolitical Pickle. It's taken a bit. I'm sorry, it's taken a bit to come, but we thank you so much. And
there'll be more episodes soon.
There'll be more episodes soon.
Rest assured.
We would like to remind you that now we are releasing our Explained, where we explain conflicts in an easy way in 10 minutes that you can take on your coffee, and they're all over
or
Facebook.
Any geopolitical issue, not only conflicts, but any geopolitical issues.
Geopolitical issues, exactly. They are released weekly or bi-weekly on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
See you next time. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye. Like, share, subscribe.
The Geopolitical Pickle is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz, two geopolitical studies postgrads from Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic. Follow us on Instagram @The Geopolitical Pickle or Twitter @The Geopickle for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.